Hello, and welcome to our next demonstration on Data Services Manager version 2.0. In this video, we're going to have a look at the Gateway API. Now, the Gateway API provides a Kubernetes type interface to allow you to interface with Data Services Manager directly through the Kubernetes command line interface, kubectl or kubectl. What we'll show you is that there's two permissions associated with the Gateway API. The first is an infrastructure administrator's permissions, which allows you to do things with the infrastructure, as the name implies. You'll be able to create infrastructure policies, IP pools, VM classes, and so on. The other Gateway API is the one that allows you to interface with the data services themselves. So you'll be able to build databases, modify databases, and so on. So how do you get started? Well, you'll have to download the kubeconfig. There's one on the vSphere client that allows you to assume infrastructure admin privileges, and there's also one in the Data Services Manager under the user profile. So depending on the permissions that you are logged in as, in this particular case, I'm a DSM admin, then this kubeconfig will give me DSM admin privileges, which will allow me to modify or create or delete the database services, database clusters that I've built within DSM. Okay, so let's download the DSM API kubeconfig with the infrastructure admin privileges, and let's have a look around. So you can see it downloads a kubeconfig gateway YAML file. So what I typically do to get started is I just rename this to an infrastructure admin, just so I know which one I'm dealing with. And just to see what resources I have available, I run the kubectl API resources. And you can see I can query a bunch of things. And for this particular set of permissions, it's the infrastructure policies, IP pools, VM classes that I'm particularly interested in. So why don't I do a kubectl get on the infrastructure policies using the same kubeconfig. And you can see I've got infrastructure policies here matching the infrastructure policies that are in the UI. Similarly, if I do a similar type of thing for IP pools, you can see them there. And if I check the IP pools, they also match up. And then if I have a look lastly at the VM classes, they also match the t-shirt size VM classes that we have here. Okay, great. So we can query the infrastructure details. Why don't I go ahead now and have a look at how I can actually create some of these objects from the kubectl. And to do that, you'll need some YAML manifests. I have some that are already created. So for instance, if I wanted to build an IP pool, I might set something up like this. So in this particular case, I'm going to build an IP pool in the 192 range. And you can see the range of addresses, the gateway and the prefix there. And I'll put a link up to GitHub where all of these are available for you to download in the end of the demonstration. So let me go ahead and apply this YAML manifest. And once again, I'll use the same kubeconfig. And now if I get my IP pools, I have my new IP pool. And if I go back to my UI, I also have my new IP pool as well. There we go. Great. So let's say I also wanted to build a database cluster that had a very large virtual machine. Let's clear this. Let's have a look. I have another YAML manifest that has an extra large VM class here. So you can see this is with 16 CPUs and 32 gigs of memory. Once more, it's just a matter of applying this extra large manifest using the same config as before. which is my infrastructure admin one. And now let's go and check my VM classes. And there's my extra large VM class created. Okay, the last thing I want to show you as the infrastructure admin, let's clear that once more, is the creation of an infrastructure policy. And I'm going to build one that also uses resource pools. If we just have a look in each of my clusters here, there's 3 clusters in my inventory, and each of them has a resource pool. You can see them here. So let's have a look at the manifest for building that infrastructure policy using resource pools. So the name of the policy, quite straightforward, I think. Whether it's enabled or not, it is. And then we're going to select an IP range from the IP pool that we just created, 192. So let's have a look at the placement information now. So for each of the clusters, you can see them written out there, cluster 1, cluster 2, you have data center, folder, the port group, and then indeed the resource pool. So cluster zone 1, resource pool A, cluster zone 2, resource pool B, and last but not least, cluster zone 3 has resource pool C. Now each of these clusters has its own vSAN data store, so I can use a vSAN storage policy as a common policy across all of the different clusters and resource pools indeed. And last but not least, we'll use a VM class of extra large, which we just built previously. So once again, it's just a matter of kubectl applying that infra policy and using the kubeconfig, which gives us the infrastructure admin privileges to apply that. So let's have a look at the infrastructure policy. This one from our kubeconfig. Looks like it created there, but let's have a look on the UI, and there indeed it is enabled and its status is ready, meaning that the contents of the YAML manifest are good. Have a look at the compute resources. You can see they're all resource pool. You can see the storage policy is the default policy. Port groups, the internal port group on our distributed switch. IP pool is the 192. VM folder is DSM across them all. And our VM class should be the extra large, and it is. So there you go. There, hopefully you can see the usefulness of using the Gateway API for creating infrastructure policies. Now, one of the things I touched on in the introduction was the fact that there are 2 different Gateway API permissions, one for the infrastructure administrator, the other for the DSM user or administrator. And so what we've been working on is the infrastructure administrator. Now, the thing is that if I wanted to build a database from kubectl, from the Gateway API, I wouldn't be able to do that with these permissions. Instead, what I would need to do is I would need to go and download the permissions that I showed you previously. And they're coming down as kubeconfig gateway. And again, because it's the same name as the infrastructure administrator manifest, what I typically do is I move this kubeconfig into kubeconfig DSM. So again, the resources that I can query are much the same. Sorry, API resources. The resources are the same as the ones that I can query with the infrastructure admin gateway manifest. So again, if I query the API permissions as the DSM user, I pretty much get the same ones as before. But the difference now is that these or this set of permissions are typically used for building MySQL clusters or Postgres clusters. They're not used for infrastructure policies and so on. So for example, if I edit the infra policy that we were working on previously for the resource pools, and I just do a simple change, like let's say I want to change this from large or from extra large to large. And now if I do a kubectl apply -f against the new infrastructure policy, or the one that has just got the changes as the DSM user, I'm not allowed to do it. The DSM admin role has no permission on infrastructure policies. But this is the user that I would use, or these are the permissions I would use to create additional clusters, whether they're Postgres clusters or MySQL clusters. And similarly, if I try to build a MySQL cluster or a Postgres cluster using the infrastructure admin permissions, I would not be allowed to do that either. I would have to be this particular user or permission, the DSM admin or the DSM user, in order to be able to create these clusters. So again, whether it's building infrastructure or whether it's actually building the database clusters and data services themselves, you can use the Gateway API to achieve both of these in the Data Services Manager version 2.0. So thank you for watching. I hope you found this video informative.